Dear colleagues, in my presentation today, I would like to look into the IOL's selection algorithm. Having an extensive experience in cataract surgery, and in particular in cataract's phacoemulsification, implantation of various models of intraocular lenses, IOLs, and I've been doing ophthalmo surgery for 40 years, during which I've accumulated my own extensive experience in implantation of various models of intraocular lenses. If you type into any search engine such words as IOL, intraocular lenses, etc., you will find a large number of results. Around 500,000 results are shown on Google, as you can see on the slide, when you type in these words. How can one find a way around all this variety of intraocular lenses and understand which ones are preferable, which ones are required for which situation, and why there is such a wide variety of them in our market? Let's try to explore various alternatives according to their classification. Lenses are divided by the material they are manufactured from, by their method of fixation in the eye, by their design, by their optical properties, and by method of their implantation. Let's look at all the options of the lens. As known, the first intraocular lens was developed by Harold Ridley, and the first implantation was performed in 1951, as reported by him in his presentations and publications. As you well know, the early experiment did not show good results when it comes to optics. This was caused by Ridley's miscalculation of optical power of the intraocular lens and led to myopia of 14 diopters and rather large astigmatism, around 5 diopters, which was associated with a large incision. The lens was made of polymethyl methacrylate, and its form and size almost copied the lens of the eye. It meant that the lens was heavy, and the likelihood of its displacement during the post-surgical period was rather high. Moreover, a large incision was required in order to implant this rather large lens with all ensuing consequences. Nevertheless, it was indeed 1951 when the era of intraocular correction had begun. And now, 70 years later, we have reached the level when in almost 100% cases of cataract extraction, we implant intraocular lenses.
На уровень почти в 100% случаев удаления катаракты мы ставим искусственный хрусталик.
So, polymethyl methacrylate, PMMA, was the first material from which Ridley's lens was made. The material is very practical and comfortable, and it is easy to lay the lens of any design from it. It's cheap and has been known in engineering and in the medical field. This material is A-reactive and does not cause inflammatory reactions. However, the big disadvantage of the material is its rigidity, which requires large incisions during cataract surgery. The next material, a rigid material, is a crystal of either leuco-sapphire or cubic zirconia. It was indeed a bold idea to make lenses from artificial diamond, and that's what leuco-sapphire and cubic zirconia are. And to make perfectly clear lens with unique optical properties from such a material. However, the clinical experience, and we had such an experience working with lenses made of leuco-sapphire and or cubic zirconia, was far from being positive. Why? Well, lenses from leuco-sapphire crystals were even heavier than PMMA lenses, and similarly required large incisions. In addition, in order to make a supporting element to fix the optical part and to make haptics for such a lens, it needed to be made from titanium, from some metal alloys which made the lens heavier and more complex haptics could injure the iris and ciliary body with all ensuing consequences.
Что приводило к тому, что хрусталики были тяжелые,
which is why we could not use these lenses for too long.
Гаптическими элементами, которые могли травмировать цилиарное тело, радужку и со всеми вытекающими отсюда последствиями. Поэтому долгое время использовать такие линзы мы не могли. Существует много
There are many materials like PMMA, such as polycarbonate, methyl methacrylate, but they are all very similar, so PMMA, so we will not dwell on them. At long last, foldable intraocular lenses. The first IOL was made from silicon. Silicon is also widely known in the medical field, in implantology. A lot of medical devices are made from silicon. Silicon is a cheap material with good optical properties, which allows to make a very clear intraocular lens from it. It is also a-reactive, does not cause a body reaction or rejection. Silicon lenses were indeed a step forward. It allowed us to make smaller incisions for implanting an IOL. It was easy to make lenses of any shape and design from this material. However, silicon is very flexible and an elastic material, which is why when a silicon lens is implanted, it opens very quickly and can slide out of the surgical forceps in the process. Again, due to flexibility of silicon lenses, it is very difficult to implant them through cartridges.
Сложно имплантировать через картриджи линзы из силикона, опять-таки из-за повышенной упругости.
Another downside of silicon lenses was the fact that they would not work with vitreoretinal surgery. Quite often during vitreoretinal surgery, we inject liquid silicon to ensure that the ocular surface is laid down in order to enhance the effect of the surgery in retinal separation, vitrectomy, and other interventions. Combining liquid silicon with silicon IOLs is impossible, since liquid silicon is absorbed onto the surface of the lens, entirely damaging optical properties of the lens, and it is almost impossible to remove it from the surface of the intraocular lens. So the research into this field opted for developing lenses from a variety of soft materials, and in particular from polyurethane methacrylate. Lenses made of this material were manufactured in Russia for some time. However, unfortunately, it turned out to be unstable as the polymerization of the material continued in the eye, which led to the lens clouding, and in most cases these lenses had to be removed and replaced with other models. A good material is collagen copolymer, which is also widely used in Russia. These are a number of lens models produced from this material. At the moment, this material is only used for manufacturing pupillary lenses. One of the models of pupillary lenses made from collagen copolymer, as well as lenses from this material, is used as phakic IOLs, as an additional lens for myopia or hyperopia correction, normally of the high degree. Another soft material is hydroxyethyl methacrylate, so-called HEMOC materials, which is well known amongst those who specialize in contact lens correction. However, the most popular materials now are hydrophilic and hydrophobic acrylic, and I'll touch upon in more details later. Now then, lenses made from polymethyl methacrylate. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the anterior chamber IOL. It is quite a well-known model and was widely used in the past as well, and perhaps the only version of the anterior chamber lens which is still relevant. We use lenses made from PMMA, which are rigid anterior chamber lenses, in cases with complications when there is no possibility to suture the lens, to implant a posterior chamber lens when there is no support in the form of capsular bag and secondary implantations. If our patient has aphakia and we want to implant this patient with an IOL, this lens is also used. The next three models, which you see here, have a similar shape and only vary by the fact that the first two have a hole either for suturing the lens, the hole in the arms, or for the lens rotation, holes in the periphery of the optical section. And finally, the third model, which is a standard posterior chamber rigid lens made from PMMA, which we widely used prior to the era of phacoemulsification, when we performed an operation by using the method of extracapsular extraction. This slide demonstrates the very first models of a silicon IOL. These are two models. One is the so-called plain haptic lens with a flat haptic, and the other is a three-part lens where the optical disc is made from silicon and the arms are made from a rigid material. This slide shows an example of a collagen copolymer lens. These are well-known lenses, RSP1, 2 and 3, manufactured by MNTK Eye Microsurgery Complex, named after Professor Fyodorov. RSP1 and 2 were widely used during transition stage from extracapsular extraction to phacoemulsification, since they were the first soft IOLs available here in Russia. I also have extensive experience of implantation of these lenses, and I'd like to say that they did not work too badly in the eye, giving good optical results. However, to date, it is the lens that you see on the right-hand side of the slide that is still relevant, and it is a pupillary lens. Its optical cylinder located in the area of the pupil, the optical disc is in the anterior chamber, and haptics are located behind the iris, which allows the lens to be fixed in the pupil like a clip. Lenses made from hydrophilic acrylic are very popular. Why is this? They have several advantages. This material is cheap, it is easy to manufacture lenses of any design from it, and these lenses are well blocked through small incisions, which has been very relevant to us since we switched to phacoemulsification. Among the disadvantages is possibility of hydration. Unfortunately, hydrophilic acrylic, once in the eye, can absorb water, which leads to a change in the optical properties of the lens. It is also a reason for a calcification, which means that various salts can penetrate the body of the lens, and that can also cause clouding. Apart from that, it is difficult to make lenses from a hydrophilic acrylic with a sharp or straight edge, which prevents epithelial cells from migration and the development of secondary cataract. Hydrophobic acrylic lenses are very popular, and I am a strong advocate of those. These lenses have a number of compelling advantages, such as their physical, chemical, and optical stability, and high refractive index, which allow manufacturing lenses to be thin and compact. And they are easily transplanted through small incisions. They have a high degree of adhesion to the capsule, as the material has the property of adhering to the posterior capsule of the lens, preventing epithelial cells from migration, and as a result, preventing the development of secondary cataract. It is easy making lenses from hydrophilic acrylic with a straight or sharp edge, which is also preventing epithelial cells from migration, and as a result, preventing development of secondary cataract. However, hydrophilic acrylic unfortunately has some disadvantages, and in particular the possibility of glistening. It is uncompleted polymerization, which means that with time, already being in the eye, the material changes its optical properties, causing the appearance of subtle fogging. It doesn't generally affect vision. However, this clouding is clearly observed through the slit lamp during examination of the lens position and its condition. These lenses are relatively high in cost, as hydrophobic acrylic is harder to manufacture, which tends to increase the price of these lenses. When it comes to the fixation method of the lenses, they are divided into pupillary, anterior chamber, posterior chamber, and lenses with fixation on the iris. Let's look at some examples. The first intraocular lenses, which became available in Russia, were iris clip lenses, and to be precise, it was the lens of Fyodorov-Zakharov, which you can see on the slide at the bottom left. It must be noted that the predecessor of this lens, its analog, was the Binhorst lens. You can see it on the slide at the top left. What's the difference between the two? The optical disc of the Binhorst lens is located in the anterior chamber on the iris. There are two supporting elements in the form of loops. The two loops which fix the lens in the pupil like a clip. Why is it that the Binhorst lens did not become widespread and did not stay in clinical practice for a long time? When the pupil was dilated, in other words reacted to light, there was a high possibility of the lens dislocating either into the posterior chamber or into the anterior one. To prevent this from happening, Fyodorov changed the design of the lens, introducing three supporting elements in the form of three arches instead of two at the back as it was in the Binhorst lens. To stop the lens and optical disc from dislocating into the posterior chamber, he added areoles which were sealed at the edge of the optics, allowing the pupil to perform, that's to expand and contract, while the lens was in place. Unfortunately, this did not guarantee that the lens would not dislocate either, and in such dislocating was indeed observed when the pupil was actively responding to light. Apart from this, in some cases the areoles came in contact with the corneal endothelium, destroying it and causing the endothelium dystrophy, which is why in later models it was decided to abandon the areoles, retaining only three arches. I must say that despite the fact that it has been a while since the lens was designed, it is still being used, and I occasionally come across patients, as you can see from the slide at the bottom right, with this implanted lenses with a good optical performance. You can see that the eye is calm, the lens is centered, and does not cause any issues. And on the top right of the slide, you can actually see the design of a pupillary lens made from collagen, a soft material. This model also still exists, still being used, and I too use it frequently, especially in cases where the patient has traumatic cataract or has some issues with the pupil. It is fairly easy to suture this lens or coloboma if it is on the iris, achieving a good optical and cosmetic result. Anterior chamber lenses. In the US, Europe and other countries, unlike Russia where the pupillary lenses were widely spread, anterior chamber lenses were the most popular and were widely used after ectocapsular and intracapsular extractions, and even after phacoemulsification in the early stages of this technology. I also often use anterior chamber lenses, especially in cases with complications such as vitreous body prolapse,
осложнений,
integrity
когда
violation of the posterior
присутствовало падение
capsule,
стекловидного тела, нарушение
and when
целостности
it was
задней
difficult to
капсулы, и тогда
fix the
сложно было
IOL in the
фиксировать
posterior
хрусталик
chamber.
в задней камере. Однако,
However, to avoid
чтобы
post-surgery
не получить
complications when
осложнения
implanting these
после
lenses,
имплантации такой
we
линзы,
must keep in mind a
необходимо
few
помнить
important points.
несколько
Firstly, it is not
важных
advisable
моментов.
implanting them
Во-первых, эти
to
линзы
patients with
нежелательно
glaucoma
ставить
due to
пациентам
the
с
fact that
глаукомой,
supporting elements
поскольку
block the
опорные
trabecular
элементы
apparatus,
блокируют
the supporting
трабекулярный
element in the
аппарат,
corner of the anterior
опоры
chamber, which leads
линз
to
в
glaucoma
углу
to
передней
develop.
камеры и, возможно,
Secondly, it
развитие
must be
глаукомы.
pointed out that the lens
Во-вторых,
must protrude
необходимо
into
помнить,
the
что линза
anterior chamber.
должна
The lens is not flat in its cross-section, but
проминировать
has a
переднюю
curve.
камеру. Линза не плоская в своем
And if you
сечении, а
implant the
имеет
lens the other way
изгиб.
around, so that
И
it
если
protrudes towards the
имплантировать линзу
pupil, we get a
наоборот, чтобы
picture
она
which you can see on
проминировала
the
в сторону
left-hand
зрачка,
side
то мы
of the
получим
slide
картину, которую
when
мы
it
видим на
blocks the
слайде
pupil
слева,
and leads
когда
to the
линза
iris
блокирует
bombae
зрачок,
pupillary
и
block.
это
The
приводит к
ocular pressure
бомбажу
increases and the
радужки,
patient may
к
lose his
зрачковому
sight due to the
блоку,
development of an
повышается
acute
внутриглазное
attack of
давление,
glaucoma.
и пациент может потерять зрение из-за
To avoid this
развития
from
острого
occurring, the
приступа
lens must be
глаукомы.
implanted with the curved
Чтобы
side
этого не
forward,
происходило,
and one
линзу
must
надо
remember
ставить
about the compulsory iridectomy.
выгнутой частью вперед, и
As you can see on the
не
slide on
надо
the right,
забывать
there are
про
two iridectomies, which
обязательные
will be
иредектомии.
preventing the
Как вы видите на
pupillary
слайде
block,
справа, две
stopping the fluid
иредектомии,
from the
которые
posterior
будут
chamber
препятствовать
entering into the
зрачковому блоку,
anterior
чтобы
chamber
жидкость из задней
and
камеры
drain
могла
out from
поступать в
the eye
переднюю
via the
камеру и
trabecular reticulum.
оттекать из глаза через трабекулярную сеть.
Out of the anterior
Из
chambers, and
линз
more precisely the lenses with the
передней
fixation
камеры,
on
а
the
точнее
iris,
из линз
the most
фиксации на
popular one at
радужке,
the moment is still the iris
довольно
claw.
популярна в
It
настоящее
is a
время
rigid
остается
lens
линза
which is
iris claw.
implanted in
Это
cases of aphakia.
жесткие линзы, которые имплантируются в случаях
As you can see on the slide on the
апофии.
left, the lens is fixed
Как
in
вы
the anterior
видите
chamber.
на левом
It holds
слайде,
onto
эта
the
линза
iris with its
имплантирована в передней
supporting
камере
elements.
своими
This model
опорными
can also be
элементами, она
implanted into the
держится за
posterior
радужку.
chamber, as you
И
can see from the
также эту
bottom
же
image
модель
on the
можно
slide,
имплантировать и в заднюю
where the
камеру,
lens on the
как видите на
posterior
слайде
chamber side
внизу,
holds onto the
где
iris.
линза
As an
со
option, there is a
стороны
soft model of iris
задней
claw,
камеры держится
but
за
this
радужку.
lens, as you can see on the right,
Как вариант,
is
есть
used as an
мягкая
aphakic
модель
lens in
iris claw,
cases where the
но эта
eye
линза,
lens is not removed
показана
and the
справа,
lens is implanted with
используется
the
в
purpose
качестве
of correction
фактичной
of high
линзы,
degrees of
когда
ametropia.
не удаляется хрусталик, а линза имплантируется для коррекции высоких степеней аметропии.
The design of the posterior chamber lenses is diverse, but fundamentally they can be divided into three models. On the right-hand side of the slide you can see the three-piece IOL. The single-piece lens is on the left on the slide, and the plate haptic lens is in the center. At the moment, all three models are available, and each of them has its own advantages and disadvantages. The three-piece IOLs, they were widely used, and the big advantage of these lenses is that they have a certain angulation between haptic and the optic part of the lens, which allows implanting them into the ciliary sulcus, and once the supporting elements in the ciliary sulcus, the optic of the lens is not in contact with the iris and does not trigger depigmentation, does not block the trabecular reticulum with the pigment from the iris, does not cause iridocyclitis, which can be associated with the irritation of the iris during the pupil excursion and the contact of the pupil with the optics of the lens.
При экскурсии зрачка и при контакте зрачка с оптикой линзы.
Apart from that, the three-piece IOLs are easy to suture to the iris and to the ciliary body due to their rigid supporting elements, and this kind of lens is fairly easy to suture. However, the lens has certain disadvantages. It is not easy to implant this lens through the delivery system, a cartridge or an injector, due to potential damage of the haptics, a possibility of the haptic element coming out of the optic part of the lens, which can have an adverse effect on the implanting process. The single-piece lenses are very popular at the moment, and I'm a strong advocate. Their advantage is the ease of implantation using cartridges and injectors. You can use both surgical forceps procedure and a cartridge injector. The lens unfolds slowly during the course of implantation, which is why if there were any issues with the capsule sac or pupil as the lens unfolds slowly, it does not damage the intraocular tissues. It has a high rotational stability. The lens adapts to any diameter of the capsule bag and does not rotate after implantation, which allows us to make lenses with toric design, as you can see from the slide on the top right, as the lens corrects not only myopia and hyperopia, but astigmatism as well. Among disadvantages of the lens is the lack of the minimal angulation between the haptic and the optic of the lens, which causes certain difficulties during lens implantation. If implantation of the capsule bag fails due to its rupture, when the capsule support is impaired, we are forced to implant the lens into the ciliary sulcus. This is not desirable, as the lens will be in contact with the iris and will cause iritis, iridocyclitis, and secondary glaucoma. For the same reason, it is not recommended to suture the lens to the iris. And finally, the lens with the plate haptic. This lens has a number of advantages, such as good centration. After its implantation, the lens immediately takes the correct position and is well centered. Among the disadvantages, we note its ability to be implanted into the ciliary sulcus for the same reasons as the single-piece lens cannot be implanted there either, due to contact with the iris and the likelihood of development of iridocyclitis and secondary glaucoma. And this is due to the fact that the lens generally lacks the angulation between its haptics and optics. On top of that, it is difficult to suture the lens, not only to the flat part of the ciliary body, but to the iris too. It also has a relatively low rotational stability. The first toric lenses had exactly that kind of haptics, plate haptics, and were rotating, which was why we opted out of using them. Optics. All modern IOLs have a UV filter which filters out the light waves of harmful spectrum from 200 to 400 nanometers. However, many manufacturers make lenses with the additional filter, a blue filter, which partially trans light waves from 400 to 500 nanometers. These lenses have a yellow dye, which is necessary to be a controversial question, and there is no consensus reached as to what lenses are better, the ones with a totally clear optics or the ones with an additional blue light filter.
Полностью прозрачной оптикой или с дополнительным фильтром синего света.
When it comes to optics, we have spherical, aspherical, toric multifocal, and multifocal toric lenses. Let's have a look at their differences.
Давайте рассмотрим, чем же эти линзы отличаются.
You can see spherical optics on the left of the slide. Despite the same optical power of the IOL, the rays refraction in the center and in the periphery happens differently, which is why we get blurred focus and spherical aberrations. Aspherical optics differ in the way that the lens has different optical powers in the center and at the periphery. Why do we need this? Well, it's in order for all the rays to eventually focus in one point, as you can see from the slide on the right.
Для чего это сделано? Для того, чтобы все лучи в итоге сходились в одну точку.
And what does that give us?
Что это нам дает? Это нам дает качество изображения.
It gives us a better quality of the image. The difference is seen particularly clear with the wide pupil, when the peripheral part of the lens is also involved. On the left of the slide, you can see the image which is seen by the patients through the spherical lenses. Everything is clear in the center, but there is distortion on the periphery. With aspherical optics, the image is of good quality both in the center and at the periphery. Multifocal lenses are divided into refractive, diffractive, diffractive-refractive, and lenses with asymmetrical rotational optics. I have quite a substantial experience in implanting multifocal lenses and received my first diploma in lens implantation in January 2005. It has been 16 years since I started implanting multifocal lenses. Let's take a look at the history of the IOL and multifocal lens development. Taking Alcon as an example, the first single-piece lenses which design we're also used to now and which are widely used in the industry came onto the market in 1994. They were followed by spherical optics lens, Acrisof IQ, and later by Acrisof IQ with toric design. Finally, in 2004, Restore lenses were introduced to the market with an add power of +4 diopters and were approved by the FDA only in 2005. I've been using them in my clinical practice since then.
Только в 2005 году они получили FDA.
During the course of technological development, the design of Alcon's multifocal lenses have been changing. Following the changes with add power of +4, we moved onto lenses with an add power of +3. They were followed by a toric multifocal lens design with an add power +3. Later we concluded that it is best to reduce the add power to +250 diopters, and the toric lenses with add power +250 appeared on the market.
Появились и торические линзы с адидацией +2,5 диоптрии. И в настоящее время, уже с 2007 года,
At the moment, and since 2007, we have been using in our practice trifocal panoptics lenses, and at the very top of this range of lenses by Alcon is panoptics with a toric design, which allows us to correct ametropia and astigmatism. If we compare Alcon multifocal lenses with various add powers, we will find that they are practically the same when it comes to design and have virtually the same optical properties, size and shape. However, they have different near focus, and the near focus with add power is +4 is about 33 centimeters, +3 is 40 centimeters, and +250 is 50 centimeters.
+3 это порядка 40 сантиметров, +2,5 это порядка 50 сантиметров.
So, depending to what the patient is used to, we choose as a general guide higher add powers for myopes to preserve their near vision for close distance. For ametropes, the best lens is with add powers +3, and for hyperopes +250.
Для гиперметропов +2,5.
Lens with asymmetric optics. On the slide, you can see the original design by Oculentis. I have extensive experience of implanting these lenses and still occasionally use them. What is interesting about the lens is multifocal optics is not designed with concentric circles, as in most lenses by other manufacturers, but by splitting the optics, One part of the lens works for near vision and the other one for distance. And what I liked and still like about them is the fact that it is not very sensitive to the exact calculations of the lens optics. If there are errors in the calculations, the patient still adapts well, and the lens works for both near vision and distance. So why did I opt out from using this lens? Firstly, I don't really like the design with the plate haptics itself when it comes to its implantation. And this lens is not ideal in cases of some complications during suturing these lenses and their fixation into the ciliary sulcus. In addition, if contraction of the capsule bag takes place over time, and it does frequently happen, or the zonule weakens as the secondary cataract develops, the lens may slightly dislocate. This leads to the fact that instead of two focuses working together, near and distance, there is only one in play, and as a result, the lens turns from a multifocal into a monofocal. Despite this, the lens is still quite popular and is widely used around the world. The table you see on the slide demonstrates the lens classifications, which is used for multifocal lens design. They are refractive, diffractive, refractive-diffractive, lenses with asymmetric optics, and the Russian original gradient lens design, Grady IOL, where we observe a gradual transition from the optics with one optical power into the optics with a different optical power. Unfortunately, this lens did not become a frequent practice, and at the moment I have no experience of implantation of this lens.
Не получила широкого распространения, и в настоящее время опыта имплантации таких линз у меня нет.
It's the era of trifocal IOLs, and for the past couple of years we have been practically stopped using multifocal lenses and moved into trifocal ones. What is so good about them, and what models do we have? The first lens that came into the market was the lens by Zeiss at 80 Lisa, which is a trifocal lens with plate haptics. It's made from hydrophilic acrylic, which in our view is not great, and neither is its form or design or haptics, which we don't like. Nevertheless, it has excellent optics, and most importantly, this lens ensured and still ensures patients good vision with any distances with near focus around 35 to 40 centimeters. Middle range focus around 1 meter, and for distance. It has no lapse, which we saw with bifocal IOLs of previous design, when the patient had good near and distance vision, but there was a lapse in the middle range. Besides, Zeiss lens is essentially pupil autonomous, which means that with various diameters of the pupil, all three focuses work, and patients did not have any issues working in bright lights or vice versa at dusk. All distances worked. The next model that came out was the lens by Alcon, the trifocal panoptics, which has the same design as all Acrysoft lenses and made from the same material. However, it had three focuses: near, middle range, and distance. Therefore, we now cover all the distances which are essential for work and a comfortable life, which is why the lens is very popular and is widely used. The lens by Rayner is also made from hydrophilic acrylic and has been in the market for some time.
Компания Rayner уже давно на рынке. Напомню, что Первая линза Ридли была сделана именно этой
If you
компанией.
recall, the very first
И
lens, Ridley's
материал,
lens, was made from this exact company,
хоть и
and
гидрофильный акрил, но
although
он
the
очень
material is hydrophilic acrylic,
качественный, с хорошими
it is very
оптическими
good quality
свойствами, и
material
дизайн
with good
линзы
optics.
также позволяет ее
The lens
имплантировать уже в малой
design allows
размеры
us
и
to
очень
implant through small
широко мы
incisions,
ее
and the lens is widely
применяем.
used.
Наконец, недавно на наш рынок вышла линза
And
Акрива
finally, the
Тернова
lens Acriva
компании
Trinova by VSY
Biotechnology,
Biotechnology has
которая
recently
также
come out in the market and is
завоевывает
getting very popular.
большую популярность. И чем она
What
отличается от
makes this
других
lens
линз,
different
это
from
тем,
others is the
что у
fact that it
нее
has good optics and
хорошая
there is no loss of light
оптика
when
и
working at near
нет
distance,
потерь
middle range, or in the
света
distance.
при работе как вблизи, так на среднем расстоянии, так и при работе
There is a
вдали.
separate category of lenses,
Есть
accommodating lenses,
отдельная
and the
категория
idea
линз
of their design is
аккомодирующих
always on the
линз. И
agenda to design the
идея
lens similar to our eye
создания
so that
аккомодирующих
optics
линз,
is
она
best matched
все
to our
время стоит на
physiology.
повестке дня. Чтобы сделать линзу по аналогии с нашим глазом,
Accommodating lenses are
чтобы оптика
designed
наиболее
into single
соответствовала нашей
optic, dual
физиологии.
optic, and
Линзы
with
аккомодирующие
deformable
делятся на
surface.
монооптический single optic, с двойной оптикал dual optic и с деформирующейся поверхностью deformable surface.
Here you see an example of a single optic
показан
lens.
здесь. Это линза
It's human optics by
линза
Tetraflex.
Tetraflex.
However,
Но
the most well-known lens that we
известная
have
линза
experience
и
with in
с
Russia
которой
is
есть опыт
Crystalens.
у нас в
Crystalens
стране, работы
AT45
это линза
and Crystalens HD.
Crystalens
You can see the
AT45 и
crystallines on the right
Линза
side of the
Crystalens
slide.
показана на рисунке справа.
The crystallens has
Линза
this interesting
Crystalens имеет
design.
вот такой
It's made from
интересный дизайн,
biosil material,
сделан
but the main
из
idea of the lens
материала биосил. Ну, основной
is
смысл
while
этой
the ciliary
линзы
body
то,
is
что
working,
при
under compression and
работе
tightening of the
цилиарного
ciliary
тела,
zonules,
при
there is a change in stress on the capsular bag,
сжатии и
and the lens protrudes
натягивании
forwards and
цинновых
backwards
связок
depending on the
идет
tightening of the
изменение
ciliary zonules.
э,
This looks like
нагрузки
the
на
physiological
капсульную
changes
сумку,
in the size
и
and shape of
линза
the lens
коллимирует
that we
и
observe in a healthy
вперед
young
или
person.
назад в зависимости от натяжения
However, this
цинного света.
animation does
То
not
есть
reflect the truth, and with time, due
похоже
to
на
fibrosis of the capsular
физиологические
bag,
изменения
this excursion of the lens
размеров
becomes
и
impossible.
формы хрусталика, что
The lens
у
eventually is fixed in one position,
здорового молодого
which is
человека.
more the so-called Z
Однако,
syndrome,
к сожалению,
and is also a
анимация
possibility
не
when the lens
отражает
is fixed in
истину,
such a complex
и
shape,
со
which
временем
leads to
за
the
счет
need of
фиброза
dissection
капсульной
of the
сумки
capsular bag or removal of the
такая
lens and its
экскурсия
replacement with
линзы
another one.
становится невозможной. Линза в итоге фиксируется в каком-то одном положении. Мало того, возможно так называемый Z-синдром, когда линза фиксируется в такой сложной форме, что приводит к необходимости
In order to preserve the excursion of the optical part of the lens and to enhance the accommodative effect,
замене ее на другую.
the lens with dual
Чтобы
optics has been
сохранить
designed, in other words, just like in optical systems,
экскурсию
in the still
оптического
camera's
элемента
lens, where
линзы,
not
чтобы
one but several
усилить
lenses moving against each other in order to
аккомодационный
enhance
эффект,
the refractive
пошли по
effect.
пути создания линз с двойной оптикой. То есть, как в оптических системах,
The same way we see here that two optical parts moving against each other and change their optical properties.
друг к другу, чтобы усилить рефракционный эффект. Так и здесь два оптических
You can see
элемента,
this on the slide by the two examples of the two lenses, synchrony and запhazy.
Это представлено на данном слайде. Две модели: линза синхронии и линза сарфарази.
Models with deformable surface are developed from the accommodative lens type.
Разрабатываются модели с деформирующейся
You can see its example on the slide.
Пример этой линзы
When the
показан
capsular bag
на
contracts, the pressure on the optics of the lens changes, the anterior surface dislocates in relation to the posterior part and either narrow the space between the surface or expand it.
смещается передняя поверхность по отношению
And if there is a flexible or a fluid material in the lens, then due to its prominence and recursion into the previous position, the optics of the central part of the lens changes, which creates the necessary optical effect.
Меняется оптика центральной части линзы, что создает необходимый оптический эффект.
Other variations of accommodative lenses are complex systems such as magnet-driven shift IOL or lenses with a fluid content, fluid vision IOL. The other rather experimental lens that's been introduced to the market but has not got to the clinical use is smart IOL. The idea behind this lens is that the material has a memory, and if you make a lens, then stretch it into a cylinder form, after implantation the lens reverses back to its original form. Fills in the capsular bag and starts to accommodate like our own lens. Unfortunately, these models have not reached practice yet and are still undergoing clinical trials. In conclusion, I would like to say that in my practice, depending on the clinical situation, I use all types of intraocular lenses, be it anterior chamber lenses, pupillary lenses, or posterior ones of different designs. In standard situations, I prefer posterior chamber lenses made from hydrophobic acrylic with clear aspheric optics. I use both monofocal and toric and multifocal lenses. Thank you for your attention.